Hey, this is Anney.
And Samantha.
And welcome to Stuff Mom Never Told You, a production of iHeartRadio.
And welcome and happy Women's International Day. International Women's Day. Yeah. I said it wrong. International Women's Day, Anney.
Yes, happy International Women's Day to you as well.
And y'all, we are actually recording the day of, just to give you a time frame. Yes, this is March 8th, 2024. And yeah, this is very current affairs. So everything we speak of is going to be relatively current. So in the last couple of years, for sure. But yeah, it's International Women's Day. And what better day than to talk about the declining birth rate? No?
Yeah. Yes.
That's a hell of an introduction, right?
Yes, definitely.
And we're going to go ahead and put a content warning. So we're not necessarily talking about anything too graphic, but there is going to be a conversation about children and babies and birthing and reproductive health. So there you go. And limited rights of women and marginalized communities.
All right. Let's
Happy International Women's Day. That's how we do it. So, and I think we talked about this actually this week. We always have these ideas for our shows, and we oftentimes, especially me, underestimate how deep some of these topics run. I will say I was able to do this one in one episode. I hope. Yeah. Unless we get to a really deep conversation, so we'll have to edit all that. But yes, this is a little larger than what I had, which we were going to do as a Monday mini, because I've seen so many TikToks about it, and I was like, yes, we need to talk about this. And I really thought that this specific topic was going to be a quick rundown of the declining population and the people who have refused to have more children as a form of protest to the ill treatment and constant abuse that they've had to suffer at the hands of the patriarchy and misogynist in Asian countries specifically. But as per usual, while doing the research, we found some connections, some disturbing connections all around the world on how politicians and people in power, i.e. men in power and racists, are trying to fight against people who can get pregnant and who are choosing not to have children. So we've had several episodes talking about different perspectives on choosing whether or not to have children, people who are not physically able to have children, and for those who do have children, the good, the bad, the difficulties, and the rewards. We've talked about the sexism, racism, and ableism, and so many other isms when it comes to the overturning of Roe v. Wade and all the other violations that are part of the aftermath. Go back to our recent episode on the Comstock Act. But today, we're not just talking about those who decide to go against societal norms and not start families, which is causing a decline in births and the population, but also talking about the link between the declining birth rate and current abortion bans that are happening today. And that's just a really minor part in this, but we thought it was important to talk about it because the link is there, the connections are there, and we need to have a broader conversation about that and where we're going with this and where it is getting frightening. It's been frightening. So with all of that, let's talk numbers. We love some numbers. According to recent reports and data, the number of people choosing not to have children has caused a significant decline of the birth rates. So much so that many governments are approaching panic to try to adjust those numbers. And to help us discuss this topic, we wanted to add this quote from visualcapitalist.com titled, "Charted the Rapid Decline of Global Birth Rates, which differentiates birth rate and fertility rate." So quote, "Birth rates are commonly measured using a metric called the crude birth rate, or CBR, which represents the number of live births per 1,000 individuals in a given population during a specific period, usually 1 year. The measured decline in CBR is also a result of plummeting fertility rates across the globe, not to be confused with birth rates. Fertility rates measure how many children a woman will have over the course of her lifetime. While a country's birth rate is directly impacted by the fertility rate, it also takes into account other factors: population size, age structure of the population, access to contraception, cultural norms, government policies, and socioeconomic conditions.
So with that, a research article that we found on the United Nations Populations Fund, or UNFPA, titled Policy Responses to Low Fertility, How Effective Are They?, says, quote, in the last 3 decades, sub-replacement fertility has spread around the world. 1/2 of the global population today lives in countries where the period total fertility rate is below 2.1 births per woman. East Asia, Southern Europe, and parts of Central, Eastern, and Southeastern Europe reached ultra-low fertility rates, with the period total fertility at 1 to 1.4 and family size at 1.4 to 1.6 births per woman born in the mid-1970s.
Right. And the information that was released in 2023 seems to only confirm these ideas. So that was from 2019. According to the same visualcapitalist.com, every country on the list has seen a decline in birth rates in the last 70 years, with some declines more staggering than the others. For example, China recorded 41 births per 1,000 people in 1950. By 2021, that number had fallen to just 7.6 at an 81% decrease. South Korea, the 29th most populous country in the world in 2021, saw an even larger 86% drop in its birth rate since 1950. In fact, almost every single country in this data set has seen a double-digit fall in their birth rates over the past 70 years. Only the Democratic Republic of Congo has seen a single-digit percentage decline between 1950 and 2021. And we know what's happening with the DRC, so I feel like those numbers are skewed. And the list they show or talk about is, quote, a snapshot of the CBR for the 49 most populous countries of the world at different years from 1950 to 2021, just to add some context.
Right. The Economist featured an article in 2023 addressing the possible consequences of the declining birth rate. The article says, quote, in the roughly 250 years since the Industrial Revolution, the world's population, like its wealth, has exploded. Before the end of this century, however, the number of people on the planet could shrink for the first time since the Black Death. The root cause is not a surge in deaths, but a slump in births. Across much of the world, the fertility rate, the average number of births per woman, is collapsing. And it continues, quote, in 2000, the world's fertility rate was 2.7 births per woman, comfortably above the replacement rate of 2.1, at which a population is stable. Today, it is 2.3 and falling. The largest 15 countries by GDP all have a fertility rate below the replacement rate. That includes America and much of the rich world, but also China and India, neither of which is rich, but which together account for more than a third of global population. The result is that in much of the world, the patter of tiny feet is being drowned out by the clatter of walking sticks. The prime examples of aging countries are no longer just Japan and Italy, but also include Brazil, Mexico, and Thailand. By 2030, more than half the inhabitants of East and Southeast Asia will be over 40. As the old die and are not fully replaced, populations are likely to shrink. Outside Africa, the world's population is forecast to peak in the 2050s and end the century smaller than it is today. Even in Africa, the fertility rate is falling fast.
So, of course, the reasons behind the lower birth rates may differ all over the world, as does the possible solutions. But according to the earlier article from UNFPA, quote, among the main drivers of low fertility is the incompatibility between professional career and family life. In times of women's massive post-secondary education and labor force participation on the one hand, and rising individualistic aspirations on the other hand, the inability to combine paid work with child-rearing often results in childlessness or having one child only. This is closely connected with persistent gender inequalities and housework divisions. For decades, societies with strong traditional gender role norms have been continuously witnessing very low fertility. More recent factors contributing to fertility decline include the trend towards intensive parenting, as well as labor market uncertainty and instability coupled with soaring house prices. And though some narratives may try to point at feminism, and it's kind of true, and the overall lack of a desire for children in the first place as the reason for birth rates declining, there's a lot of research showing that desirability for children hasn't gone down at all.
Yeah, I actually read a interesting article kind of relating to this the other day about how a lot of parents can only afford to have one kid. Like they want kids, but they can only have the one. So there's this like really big explosion of single only children. But that puts pressure on them because, at least in the US, a lot of times the children have to pay for your parents when they get older, when they get sicker. And so it's sort of causing this really negative effect of these kids not being able to afford that and kind of getting really in bad financial situations because they're the only child, which a lot of that situation is messed up anyway. Like we shouldn't, our medical system in the US is not good.
Exactly.
But
exactly.
I thought that was interesting because I hadn't really considered that before.
Well, I've definitely been told many times who's going to take care of you when you're old.
Yes, me too. Exactly.
And how are you going to be all alone?
Yeah.
Thanks, Mom.
Thanks, Mom. Okay, well, here's a quote from theconversation.com about the U.S. birth rates and some data they had found during their research. Quote, "We found remarkable consistency in childbearing goals across cohorts. For example, if we look at teenage girls in the 1980s, the cohort born in 1965 to 69, they plan to have 2.2 children on average. Among the same age group in the early 21st century, the cohort born in 1995 to 1999, girls intended to have 2.1 children on average. Slightly more young people plan to have no children now than 30 years ago, but still, the vast majority of U.S. young adults plan to have kids, around 88% of teenage girls and 89% of teenage boys. We also found that as they themselves get older, people plan to have fewer children, but not by much. This pattern was also pretty consistent across cohorts. Among those born in 1975 to 79, for instance, men and women, when they were 20 to 24, planned to have an average of 2.3 and 2.5 children, respectively. These averages fell slightly to 2.1 children for men and 2.2 children for women by the time respondents were 35 to 39. Still, overwhelmingly, most Americans plan to have children, and the average intended number of children is right around 2.
Right. And I think you and I have talked about when we saw ourselves in early 20s, we really thought by 25 we would have 2 children. I had 2 children in mind. It had to be an even number. And I just saw a TikTok about that, about how because one of them will be alone if activities or if they have to ride a plane and then you have to separate, all these things about wanting to have either 2 or 4. Mm-hmm. To make sure that didn't happen. And I was like, yeah, and also the middle child syndrome, the fact that you don't want to have one middle child of the 3 because that's too traumatic, at least have 2 so they can bond.
That's a middle child.
Of course, I'd never planned to have a big family. Mm-hmm. I also had said that it would depend on my husband. Even being very much into the Jesus world, mm-hmm. I knew that if I was doing this alone, hell nah.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that's another factor to consider in this conversation.
Right. But I really did think that I was going to have that many children. And then as I get older and older, and at this point, it's almost too late. I say not really, but because I have friends my age who just had children. I'm like, congratulations. And they're all happy and healthy. And I love that for them. But I've up until recently, the last 3-4 years, I could not have afforded. I was living with people. I was mm-hmm. actually having roommates. So there's no way to me that I could have actually had a child to pay for all the things and had a full-time job. And the amount of responsibility to me was too much. And just the thought of it made me have a panic attack.
Yeah, that's one of the things that frustrates me the most when I'll see sort of the millennials or whatever generation that's younger is ruining everything. They're not buying houses. They're not getting kids. I'm like, we can't afford it.
Right.
I mean,
this is different.
I'm sure plenty of people would like to, but actually it's kind of a responsible decision to be like, you know what?
Right.
I can't afford it. It's sad if you want kids and you can't afford them, but thought is going into it of okay, I can't do this right now.
And I'm sure many people will be like, we turned out fine. We weren't rich, all these things. But then you also have to be like, yeah, but there's also a lot of trauma. not a lot of people who are not okay. So just don't forget that part. Like, yes, for sure. Absolutely. And this is not even adding on to like health issues. So if you are a disabled individual, trying to manage all of that on top of, like, there's so many points to this conversation that we even leave out, because all of these studies and all of these incentives, and I should have put this at the top, are very much based on a heteronormative cis couple and an ableistic idea that they are perfectly able to have children without complications. So because, one of the things that we're not going to mention in here is the medical expenses, which should be one of the number one things, because, the U.S. being the biggest problem with like subsidized healthcare. That's not, anyway, mumble, because the healthcare sucks. But when we talk about that in general, that the cost of all of that is also a problem, but we don't mention that here. And again, when we're talking about these, who they are actually going after, especially in these countries, they're going after a heteronormative couples, because we don't mention it, but like Japanese government is not focused at all on the queer community, as in fact, it's almost like doubling down, saying they don't need rights at one point. So just a reminder. And along with all the facts found in the UNFPA article, it speaks to the fact that many couples are waiting much later to have children, which may limit the amount of kids they intend to have. They write, compared with earlier eras, people today start having their children later. These delays also contribute to declining birth rates. Because people start later, they have less time to meet their childbearing goals before they reach biological or social age limits for having kids. As people wait longer to start having children, they are also more likely to change their minds about parenting. And yes, that's where I am, y'all.
But they also note that the reasons stated earlier were very much linked to the decline. The article continues, but why are people getting a later start on having kids? We hypothesize that Americans see parenthood as harder to manage than they might have in the past. Although the U.S. economy overall recovered after the Great Recession, many young people in particular feel uncertain about their ability to achieve some of the things they see as necessary for having children, including a good job, a stable relationship, and safe, affordable housing. At the same time, the cost of raising children, from childcare and housing to college education, are rising. And parents may feel more pressure to live up to high-intensive parenting standards and prepare their children for an uncertain world.
All of that is absolute reasons for me that I decided I did not want to have children. Now, we've gotten the general numbers and facts, so we've got a good base. We're going to look more closely at some of the countries that have been making headlines when it comes to this conversation. And we'll start with the original idea behind this episode, the Asian countries. And we're only focused on 3 major, so don't come at me because there's so much more out there, but we were just trying to get examples. And we're talking about the women who've made a not so subtle statement, you know? Like we've talked a little bit about the feminist movement in South Korea and the activists who've been fighting back against an administration that has been using every misogynistic tactic to reverse a lot of the work that seemed to be happening once upon a time when it came to moving forward in feminism. And that included the 4B movement. Check out our Feminists Around the World episode we talked about. But just as a quick reminder, the 4B movement is the 4 no's, which originated in 2018, 2019, according to like being public, and stands for no sex with men, no child rearing, no dating men, and no marriage to men. And although this is a simple version of what the overall movement means, the stance is to amplify the stark disadvantages placed on women in the nation, as well as the overall abusive nature of the patriarchal state of the country. And this, with the attributing factors we mentioned before, it's not surprising that South Korea is currently the #1 country with the lowest current birth rate in the world. And it's been like that for about 3-4 years.
Well, according to a recent BBC article published this month, South Korea has the lowest birth rate in the world, and it continues to plummet, beating its own staggeringly low record year after year. Figures released on Wednesday show it fell by another 8% in 2023 to 0.72. This refers to the number of children a woman is expected to have in her lifetime. For a population to hold steady, that number should be 2.1. If this trend continues, Korea's population is estimated to have by the year 2100.
Right. And I don't know where North Korea comes into the play with this. I'm guessing it doesn't because the statistics aren't from there. But that's that's drastic. And honestly, yeah, like we said, this may be one of those situations where they could blame feminism for the declining population because the people, they've had enough. For many of the women in Korea, they have learned that having a child could not only be adding on more responsibility, but also cost them their job, their independence, and overall their freedom. According to the same BBC article, they say the Korean women know too much, essentially. One 28-year-old woman who worked in HR said she's seen people who were forced to leave their jobs or who were passed over for promotions after taking maternity leave, which had been enough to convince her to never have a baby. Korean women are the most highly educated of those in the OECD countries, and yet the country has the worst gender pay gap and a higher than average proportion of women out of work compared to men. Researchers say this proves they're being presented with a trade-off: have a career or have a family. Increasingly, they are choosing a career. And for those who would gladly choose family over career, they can't afford to do it. The article continues, more than half the population live in or around the capital Seoul, which is where the vast majority of opportunities are, creating huge pressure on apartments and resources. Seoul's birth rate has sunk to 0.55, the lowest in the country. Then there's the cost of private education. While unaffordable housing is a problem the world over, this is what makes Korea truly unique.
But housing isn't the only problem. The price for education for children also adds up. Here's another quote. From the age of 4, children are sent to an array of expensive extracurricular classes, from math and English to music and taekwondo. The practice is so widespread that to opt out is seen as setting your child up to fail, an inconceivable notion in hyper-competitive Korea. This has made it the most expensive country in the world to raise a child. A 2022 study found that only 2% of parents did not pay for private tuition, while 94% said it was a financial burden.
And y'all, if you've watched any K-dramas, you know this is true. Like, people get real, like, people have died according to the K-dramas.
Oh my goodness.
Trying to get these kids into these classes. And like, it is like, from what I understand, private tutors who are acclaimed, they're almost as famous as K-pop people. Like,
wow.
Education is very valued. And we've kind of always known this to the point that it became a joke. But it is costly, which I'm like, I always think, I'm like, would I have been one of those 2% that didn't make it? Probably. Oh, sad me. And of course, this all comes with the expectation that women will continue their level of housework and child rearing at the same time as helping with income. That BBC article continues. Over the past 50 years, Korea's economy has developed a breakneck speed, propelling women into higher education and the workforce and expanding their ambition. But the roles of wife and mother have not evolved at nearly the same price. And still, I think there's a whole thing about in-laws too and who takes care of them. And it's the wife. Like, it's this like over the top understanding that you are taking over not only your own household, but his household. And in some respect, that tradition is still pretty steeped. And the government, they've seen it coming. And instead of seeing that they need to actually talk to those that's affected by it the most, they try to throw some money at their problems.
Of course. Here's a quote from a March 2024 article published in Time.com. President Moon Jae-in launched several policies to try and incentivize women to have more children, including cash incentives for families. Under the scheme, every child born from 2022 onwards receives a cash bonus of 2 million won, $1,850 to help cover prenatal expenses, in addition to a monthly payout that increases every month until the baby turns 1. Other incentives include free daycare, subsidized pay during childcare leave, and even group blind dates for public servants to try and matchmake couples.
Oh, yeah. So they can help. So, in fact, the country has spent an estimated $200 billion to try to fix this problem. But as of today, hasn't resulted in any changes. And they've tried other solutions, including hiring nannies from Southeast Asian countries and paying them below minimum wage. Gross. Trying to incentivize exempting men from military services if they have children when they're under the age of 30, which sounds like a misdirect, but apparently, according to another study, men are part of the big problem too as well, maybe because they can't find women. I don't know, but I said that. And other tactics like this. But it wasn't until just recently that the politicians, and I mean like 2023, that the politicians realized that maybe talking to the citizens, specifically women or those who can give birth, may be helpful. And yeah, in the past year, they have been going around the country talking to the younger generations. But yeah, still no results as of yet that we have seen or talked about. I haven't seen any published saying that that's helping and anybody's changing their minds, because most of them are not. And China has been going through a similar decline. Of course, the history of China and babies, not good. Not good. In 1980, the Chinese government implemented the one-child policy, which was so strict that women were forced into situations they did not choose for themselves. According to an article written for the Global Institute of Women's Leadership, a Chinese researcher wrote, for 35 years, from 1980 to 2015, the Chinese government maintained a one-child policy, subjecting millions of women to forced contraception, forced sterilization, and forced abortion. And there have been stories about the level of cruelty the government would use in order to maintain that one-child policy, including the killing of newborn infants, kidnapping of women if they were on their second or more pregnancy, or even taking family members of the pregnant person as hostages if that expectant person was in hiding. So they went all out. And it was in 2016, a year after they dropped the one-child policy, the government increased it to 2, and it now has risen to a 3-child policy, allowing people to have up to 3 children now.
Right, but there are many who are so traumatized by the past policies that they still live as if they are still under those policies. Here's a quote from an article from NPR. The policy permeates through Chinese society in other, sometimes unexpected ways. Because many prioritized having a son over a daughter, orphanages experienced a surge in baby girls who were abandoned or put up for adoption. Singles Day, China's biggest online shopping holiday, akin to Black Friday in the U.S., is a recognition of the many bachelors who are unable to find partners in a gender-skewed society.
So that could be part of the reason.
It could be.
But the understanding is also there's still kind of a preference to men, to boys,
yep.
Which doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
In the greater scheme of things. But I digress. And though they have changed the policy since then and now seem to recognize that there may be a problem with the fact that the population has declined, they have been second largest for the past few years. India has been number 1 for the most populous, which seems to be a blow to the nation's ego. That surprised me. I figured that's what they wanted, but okay. But their new policies hasn't changed the birth rate.
Yes. Adding on to the imbalance of gender in the population, the cost of living and gender inequality has also affected the numbers, much like South Korea. According to CNBC, as more women attain higher qualifications and rise up the ranks in the workplace, they expect their husbands to earn more than them. In 2020, female students accounted for almost 42% of doctorate degree enrollment, and a significantly higher number of women enrolled for a master's degree than men, Statista data showed.
Yeah. And of course, so that means people have been choosier when it comes to finding their man, to the point that people have been throwing money, governments, and corporations have been throwing money at men to make them look better for mating purposes. Like, I don't know how else to say that.
I mean, you're right, but it sounds so like we're in a nature documentary.
It kind of is. This is where we're going at. And just as a reminder, but this still is the expectation that women will take on all of the household work, and that women have less rights and will be responsible for this entirety of growth of populations, essentially. And of course, add to that, the rising costs of housing and supplies, as we talked about earlier, along with the increase of children allowed per household, the government and even corporations have tried to add incentives for people to have more children. Trip.com has tried to help with the situation specifically. According to that same CNBC article, Trip.com is one Chinese company that takes pride in trying to encourage more women to have children. In an organization where more than half of its 30,000 employees are women, the online travel agency came up with its own solution to encourage women in the company to have more children. And a part of that incentive is offering subsidies to help with the cost of freezing eggs, which actually kind of smart to me.
Yeah.
Because they do talk about the fact that that time frame that women specifically use to get their career and all that stabilized is that, I guess the critical time, but it's a short time, so they can actually help them pause that process. Maybe that will increase in the likelihood that they will have children later on. They were talking about this. And they help by giving this money, which ranges from $15,000 to $300,000. Again, kind of a smart idea. I might have done that, to be honest. Not now with the IVF stuff in the U.S.
No.
But, this is to me, it's one of the smarter plans. I don't know.
Yeah. I saw a flyer once at my university that was like, we'll pay you this much money to freeze your eggs. And I thought about it, but then I was like, but why?
I had people who said they want my eggs.
Oh.
They would pay you for your eggs.
Really?
You don't know? You didn't get those? Am I the only one? That's weird.
I saw a flyer. I don't recall anyone asking me.
I got email.
Oh, okay.
And I was like, what? And I thought about it for a split second. I'm not going to lie. I'm like,
oh.
But they wanted white babies, so didn't help.
Oh, alas. Well, the government has tried a few tactics as well, going back to China. According to Time, quote, Chinese government also tried to introduce new policies to encourage couples to have more children, enhance childcare, and improve housing facilities for families with children. Recently, some academics have even proposed taxing couples for having too few children while making access to abortion and divorce harder. And yeah, pay attention to that last part, limiting access to divorce and abortions.
Right.
Yeah.
So the Japanese birth rate has also been greatly declining. Very similar to South Korea, many have chosen not to have children due to the inequality in gender rights and opportunities, as well as the overall financial burden of having a family.
According to financialpolicy.com, quote, today, Japanese women on average have just 1.26 children, far below the rate of 2.1 children per woman, considered by demographers as necessary to maintain a stable population. Up to 40% of adult Japanese women and 50% of men will not have children in their lifetime, according to government estimates.
And again, much like South Korea, a lot of the reasons boil down to the cost of living, cost of education for children, and according to the same foreignpolicy.com article, the cost for childcare alone in Japan for 2 children is about half the earnings of a couple who have full-time incomes, and the wages have barely been raised in the past 30 years, so significant amount. And just the overall lack of interest in being married, although that could also have something to do with the affordability. So here's another quote from foreignpolicy.com. It's not just the desire to have children that's diminished. Surveys point to waning interest in relationships and sex, especially among young people. For Haruko Sakamoto, a researcher at the Department of Global Health Policies at the University of Tokyo, this too is an economic story. Young people, she explained, simply do not earn enough to plan for the long term, making stable relationships seem far-fetched. She says, while in the past people have explained Japan's low sex and relationship culture as stemming from interest in anime and fictional characters that supplant interest in real-life relationships, it's actually an economic issue. I just really like that they blamed anime on this. And the article continues, Machika Ueda-Balmer, a political scientist at Syracuse University in the U.S., who studies social isolation among Japanese youth, said many young Japanese women would like to get married, but they simply cannot afford it. Survey data shows that young people don't have the financial stability necessary to build themselves as a viable partner. The result is that people don't get married. And because Japan has the lowest rate of children born outside of marriage among developed countries, this also means they are unlikely to have children. So in 2013, they had what was considered womenomics, policies which, quote, promised to integrate women into the workforce and propel them to high-paying jobs. But the policy hasn't solved women's economic problems. So like many other nations, women were not only responsible for the house, home, and children, but they also took on the financial responsibility portion as well.
Here's another quote. In the age of womenomics, Japanese women are caught in a double bind. High living costs mean they are no longer expected to stop working once they have children. Yet because they still bear the brunt of domestic work, even Japan's generous parental leave benefits, which few men choose to take, are not enough to insulate women from the pressure to drop out of the labor force after having children. Even highly educated women who leave the labor force after having children struggle to eventually reintegrate back into it. Some fear that in case of divorce, they'll be unable to stay afloat financially, in part because of the stark gender pay gap.
So the Japanese government has followed suit with many of the East Asian countries. Late 2023, the prime minister announced an estimated $22 billion to childcare spending in order to help the birth rate, and he plans to increase subsidized housing for families with children and flexible work hours. Of course, as we've seen, money may not be the answer to all the problems, but hey, I guess he's trying. I will say, and we're going to talk about this in a sec, better than what the U.S. is doing.
That's true.
And though we just used, again, these three countries for the examples, the steady decline of birth rate has been seen throughout the world. Taiwan has spent over $3 billion trying to encourage people to have more children, including more parental leave and large increases in salary. And in fact, one presidential candidate offered a free pet if they have a child. I'm not going to lie, that could have worked on me, too.
But then you have to pay for the pet.
I know. I don't know that he added money to that, but I was like, well, that's an interesting tactic.
Now I've got to pay for the kid and the pet. And according to the Vox article titled, "You Can't Even Pay People to Have More Kids," quote, other countries have tried direct payments to parents. Russia began offering a one-time sum of about $7,000 to families with more than 2 kids, while Italy and Greece have experimented with per-child baby bonuses. In 2019, Hungary introduced a loan of about $30,000 to newlyweds. If they have 3 children, the loan is forgiven.
I actually saw something out, I think it's Sweden, y'all correct me if I'm wrong, that literally are trying to bring people in with children.
Oh, wow.
Too, and they'll give you, and then you have to live there for 10 years. And they'll give you money and incentives.
I had a friend that moved to Sweden. I should ask her what's...
Okay. I think Sweden is one of the S European countries, so y'all tell me. Switzerland, Sweden, I don't know.
Okay.
And yes, again, declining birth rate includes the U.S. So we said this earlier, the U.S., the birth rate of the population is declining. Here's a quote from that same Vox article, which is mentioned. In the U.S., the birth rate has been falling since the Great Recession, dropping almost 23% between 2007 and 2022. Today, the average American woman has about 1.6 children, down from 3 in 1950, and significantly below the replacement rate of 2.1 children needed to sustain a stable population.
And as we mentioned previously, many people have decided to wait to have children. And though the birth rate has declined overall, the birth rate for people 35 to 39 has actually increased. According to census.gov, in a 30-year period, it has increased by 67%. Here's a bit from CNN.com from the article titled, "Fertility Rates Dip, People Are Having Babies Later, the Stage of Birth Rates in the U.S." Quote, "Birth rates have declined in most states across the U.S. in recent years, while women are having babies at an older age, according to new data released by the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention." And it continues, "Birth rates among women in their late 30s and early 40s rose in the last decade, and the birth rate among women over 45 also exceeded 1 birth per 1,000 population for the first time in more than a decade. Meanwhile, the teen birth rate dropped to a record low in 2022. There were 13.5 births for every 1,000 teens ages 15 to 19, down from 13.9 in 2021, according to the new CDC data."
13. Damn.
Yeah.
Those numbers are so high. And I feel like they are purposeful, especially now. And though there was a small increase during the initial pandemic and lockdown, nothing shows any actual signs of the race on the incline. Here's a quote from the CNN article. Despite the short-term plunge and comeback during the early years of the COVID pandemic, the rates have been consistently trending down. Nearly 3.7 million babies were born in 2022, according to the CDC analysis of birth certificates. The overall fertility rate was 56.1 births per 1,000 women ages 15 to 44, holding relatively steady from the rate of 56.3 in 2021. After a sharp drop in 2020, birth rates rose in 2021, the first increase since 2014, but the numbers still reflect a decline that began before the pandemic. Okay, of course, unlike the other countries, U.S. hasn't been publicly talking about the population decline, or even talking about policy changes directly related to having more children, such as giving money to parents directly, helping childcare costs, or the such. Although they did alter some tax deductions for children. They made higher tax deductions and gave a little more incentive, but it definitely did not seem as it was about population control or population increase. But much like how we mentioned, China has been doing more restricted when it comes to abortion access and divorce. The U.S. has implemented the same practices, but using alternative languages for it. So during campaign runs for the Republican Party, a couple of significant figures may have said the quiet part out loud. In 2023, Nebraska Republican state senator used an old racist theory to argue for the ban on abortion. According to NewRepublic.com, quote, Senator Steve Erdman decided that the best argument in favor of the ban was, quote, the Great Replacement Theory, which the Southern Poverty Law Center defines as, quote, racist conspiracy narrative that falsely asserts there is an active, ongoing, and covert effort to replace white populations in current white majority countries. Our state populations have not grown except by those foreigners who've moved here or refugees who've been placed here, Erdman told the chamber. And it continues. Erdman also says that all of the aborted fetuses could be working and filling some of those positions that we have vacancies in response to jobs.
Okay.
Yeah. So before we continue, so here's a look about here's a quick look at the Great Replacement Theory from a PBS article. Simply put, the conspiracy theory says there's a plot to diminish the influence of white people. Believers say this goal is being achieved both through the immigration of non-white people into societies that have largely been dominated by white people, as well as through simple demographics with white people having lower birth rates than other populations.
And how does all of that equal to combating of the declining birth rate? Here's some more from Senator Erdman, according to Vice.com. Our state population has not grown except by those foreigners who have moved here or refugees who have been placed here. Why is that? It's because we've killed 200,000 people. These are people we've killed, Erdman said during debate after lamenting that if abortion had been illegal, that would have resulted in more people who could be working and filling some of those positions that we have vacancies.
And he's not the only one to say these things out loud. CPAC Republican leader also made a point to use the same rhetoric. He said, if you say there's a population problem in the country, but you're killing millions of your own people through legalized abortion every year, if that were to reduce, some of that problem is solved, Schlapp said. You have millions of people who can take many of these jobs. How come no one brings that up? If you're worried about this quote-unquote replacement, why don't we start there? Start with allowing our own people to live. And again, he's not the only one. The Ohio representative said something similar as well. This narrative has been around for a very long time. As in fact, it's actually been around also targeting the Jewish community as well. But this has been a constant rhetoric. And if you want to talk about our episodes when it comes to trad wives, our episodes when it comes to the red pill, our episodes when it comes to religious trauma, they're all linked in this same conversation with this white supremacist rhetoric that we have to bring more white people in to bring in power, that they've lost power, so therefore they need to have babies, and that abortion ban is the key. Unfortunately, these tactics have worked enough to sway what is happening within the U.S., but politics alone is not what is controlling this narrative. So are the corporations. The economic threat of a population decline has become clear to many experts around the world. But not all corporations have come to this same understanding at this point. Like we said, Trip.com and Japan have kind of figured it out. They're like, okay, we need to help with this. There's other companies that have been adding to that. We know some of the companies here in the U.S., and usually the smaller companies have been like, we'll give you longer maternity leave, better maternity leave. We have free childcare here. But not everybody. Amazon, prime example. Could care less.
That was an accidental pun. I liked it.
I didn't even know. A lot of the corporations are seeking to strip even more rights from their employees, many encouraging discrimination for those who become pregnant. As in fact, recently, federal courts ruled that the, quote, Pregnancy Work Fairness Act was unenforceable against the state government and its agency, which this act protects accommodations for pregnant employees in the workplace and allows workers to sue employers for failing to do so. It prohibited employers from denying employment opportunities or forcing pregnant workers to go on leave if alternative accommodations were possible. And this is from the TexasTribune.org, which is where all of this was coming out from. So that is significant to know that was on a federal appeal. And it's very scary because not only are we being told you have to be pregnant if you were to conceive, if you were to get pregnant, do you have to remain pregnant and go and give birth, but that you have no rights and they're not going to help you. There were several articles that we talked about within the Great Replacement Theory and these senators who literally kept saying, oh, Social Security will help, which we know is dwindling very quickly, and it is pretty much non-existent for any of us who want to retire at this point. I believe the boomers were the last to be able to really get anything from the Social Security Administration. There's so much that we have to look at when we talk about this, because it goes hand in hand when we talk about the declining of birth rates. And as we're looking at other countries, we're looking at European countries who have a little better incentives and kind of are willing to pay a lot more, and it's costly, as many will say, to make it better. There's many who won't do that here in the U.S. And in fact, again, they're doing the opposite by kind of leaning towards China's policies, which is really funny and ironic right now to me, with trying to force a population boom. And it's working, and that's what's scary. But again, this seems to be have your cake and eat it too situation for both the politicians and corporations. And I will say some activists in the U.S. have talked about similar tactics to those in other countries. I know there was like the sex strike during one point that was in talks, talking about not having children, talking about not getting married, talking about remaining single, which, I get it. But with what is happening, and as rights continue to be stripped, it will be likely that the decline will only continue because people are fed up. Yeah, I have at least two friends who have pretty much said the shop is closed. Like they're just, and it breaks my heart because like if you want to have sex, if you want to have kids, it shouldn't be. But they've been like, as long as this is the situation, I'm not going to do it. Which feels very upset. It's very upsetting, but it also feels kind of funny because I don't think that's what they wanted the outcome to be of these things. But that's what I've heard from multiple people. It's like, okay, right. Cool. I will be interested to see what happens in the next couple of years because we know that pregnancies due to rape has increased, which is horrifying. But at the same time, I don't know if it's just me, but I'm getting more and more disturbing pieces about children's deaths. And some of them like literal. I just watched one, crime thing where a mom was so flustered because she could not financially provide. She did not trust her former the children's father to take care of them, and so gave them the best day and then unfortunately murdered them I guess it's a sad state. And that's not the only case I've seen as of recently. I've seen more and more. And I feel like this may honestly be a thing that we see because women are not seeing. Again, we've talked about the fact that the abortion ban is only going to kill women, but I don't think people can estimate the route of desperation that many people will have from these situations. Again, same thing with forced labor, forced birth for those who have been molested and raped. Similar to that conversation of the desperation that you're not going to understand. I'm horrified by what's happening, but I don't think any of these tactics are going to push to an increase in births the way they think it will.
No, I don't think so either. There's so much like really fundamental systemic things that have to change, I believe, for people to.
Right. Again, hello. Having childcare, having money to feed yourself, having money to have a bedroom for your child. Those are all things that are dictating whether or not we want to have children.
Yes. Yeah, seems pretty obvious.
You would think. But I feel like 2023, South Korea really like, oh, I guess we should talk to those who can give birth. What?
Maybe we should ask them.
Maybe we should ask them. And then we have literally gone backwards in the U.S. on how to handle it. Again, the pretense is we're saving lives.
Yeah. Yep. Well, we have a lot of episodes about this. As you said, Samantha, it is related to a lot of other issues. This is another very intersectional thing. But yeah.
Happy International Women's Day.
Happy International Women's Day, Samantha.
Good luck, everybody.
Oh, gosh. I'm glad to spend it with you.
I'm glad to spend it with you, too.
And I'm glad for anyone who joined us on this day or any other day. If you have any thoughts about this, please let us know. You can email us at stephaniamomstuff@iheartmedia.com. You can find us on Twitter at momstuffpodcast or on TikTok and Instagram at Steph I Never Told You. We have a TeePublic store. And we have a book you can get wherever you get your books. Thanks as always to our super producer, Christina, our executive producer, Maya, and our contributor, Joey.
Thank you.
And thanks to you for listening. Stuff I Never Told You is a production of iHeartRadio. For more podcasts from iHeartRadio, you can check out the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to your favorite shows.